You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On August 8th, 1998, Sharon Anderson's eyes shot open to the sound of her 8-year-old son's wailing. She glanced over at the bedside clock and saw it was only 4 a.m. Toby, her son, was a very deep sleeper, so she knew it had to be something serious to wake him up at this hour. So Sharon jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to his room. Toby was still in his bed, and he was holding his belly with both hands. He was covered by a film of sweat, and he was moaning in pain. Sharon laid the back of her hand on Toby's forehead, and she found that he was burning hot. In fact, he felt much hotter than when he normally got sick. Sharon knew her son needed medical attention right now. She rushed back to her bedroom, woke up her husband, and told him to go get the car ready so they could drive their son to the emergency room. Then she ran back to Toby's room, she scooped him up in a blanket, and carried him down the hall. It was still dark out as Sharon and her husband loaded Toby into their car. Fortunately, the streets of Minneapolis were empty at that hour as they raced to the nearest hospital. Attending physician Dr. Jean Miller was just starting her shift when her office intercom buzzed and a voice announced that an 8-year-old boy named Toby had just been wheeled into the ER. His mother, Sharon, said Toby had been feverish for hours and was throwing up. Dr. Miller jumped up from her desk and dashed down the hall to the emergency room. She found Toby lying in bed, his eyes half open and his skin drained of color, while his pajamas were dark with sweat. The boy's parents hovered beside the bed looking worried and helpless. Dr. Miller called for a nurse to bring an IV saline drip to get some fluids into the boy. Then she measured his heartbeat and listened to his breathing. But the child's intense stomach pains suggested that whatever was going on was an intestinal issue. That covered a lot of possibilities, from food poisoning to something much more serious like appendicitis. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents if he'd eaten anything unusual lately. They looked at each other and listed various meals from the past few days, but then said that nothing out of the ordinary came to mind. Dr. Miller nodded, then asked Toby where it hurt most. With very shaky hands, Toby pointed to his stomach. Tears formed in his eyes, and he told Dr. Miller the pain was getting even worse. Dr. Miller smiled calmly, doing her best to hide her concern that Toby seemed to be sinking. The doctor grabbed a phone off the wall and called the lab to order blood and stool samples. That would likely identify what was happening inside of Toby's body. The doctor was pretty sure it was some kind of food poisoning, but the boy's intense discomfort suggested that it could be more serious than your run-of-the-mill 24-hour stomach bug. Dr. Miller took the parents aside and told them to make a list of every food and every place that Toby had eaten in the past 4 days. Dr. Miller promised they would find out what was happening to their son and they would do everything in their power to make him right again. A few hours later, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was the lab with Toby's results. They found blood in Toby's stool, which indicated intestinal bleeding, most likely from bacteria in his food. So Dr. Miller had apparently been right. It was some kind of food poisoning. Now they needed to figure out what kind of food poisoning it was. The lab technician said they had already isolated the bacteria from Toby's stool for closer analysis. Dr. Miller thanked the technician and hung up. The good news was that they were now closer to knowing what was making Toby sick. But the bad news was, until then, Dr. Miller could not really aggressively treat Toby's illness. For many bacterial infections, the best treatment is antibiotics, but with certain strains of bacteria, such as highly toxic strains of E. coli, antibiotics can actually make the patient sicker or even kill them. So for now, all Dr. Miller could do was keep Toby's fever down with medication and his dehydration at bay with an IV drip. Dr. Miller checked in with Toby's parents and told them to get some rest and that she would be back at the hospital first thing in the morning. Then the doctor left the room and went to the night nurse and told her to please contact her at home if anything changed with Toby. The next morning, Dr. Miller had just sat down behind her desk with a mug of coffee when a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said there was a new arrival to the ER, a 4-year-old girl named Peyton Egger. She had a sweltering 104-degree fever, and her mother said she'd been vomiting on and off for 12 hours with repeated bouts of diarrhea. Dr. Miller's mind raced as she followed the nurse down to the emergency department. White curtains were drawn all around a gurney that had just been wheeled in. Little Peyton was lying on the gurney, drenched in sweat. Her face was drained of color, and she was struggling to keep her eyes open, and her parents stood to the side, clutching each other nervously. Dr. Miller immediately ordered the nurses to hook Peyton up to an IV drip while she checked the girl's vitals. Peyton's pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was dropping. Dr. Miller worried she might be going into shock, which could cause her organs to shut down. Dr. Miller realized that Peyton's symptoms were very similar to Toby's, so much so that she wondered if both kids had caught the same infection. Peyton's parents told Dr. Miller that their home was in a suburb north of Minneapolis, which was nowhere near where Toby's family lived. Still, Dr. Miller thought there must be something these two kids had in common. Dr. Miller called the lab and told them she wanted full blood work run on Peyton, plus stool samples tested as well. Then, Dr. Miller took Peyton's parents into the hallway and asked them for more details. The mother said that Peyton had been complaining of stomach pains last night, but it really hadn't seemed that serious. But at around midnight, Peyton woke up crying from all the pain and then began vomiting. After that, she kept vomiting nearly every hour and had several episodes of severe diarrhea. Then her temperature started spiking. By dawn, the parents said it was clear that whatever this was, it was only getting worse. So her parents had rushed her to the hospital. Dr. Miller said they had done the right thing. Peyton would be safe here. For now, the best thing they could do was just stay calm and wait. But that was advice Dr. Miller found easier to give than to practice. As Dr. Miller stepped out of Peyton's room and headed back to her office, a nurse hurried up to her and said the lab had been trying to reach her. Toby's new results were in. The boy was infected with a bacteria called Shigella. Finally, Dr. Miller knew what she was up against. Shigella attacks the digestive system, causing inflammation and bleeding within 12 to 48 hours after eating food contaminated with the bacteria. Toby had all of the classic symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea. Dr. Miller knew that if untreated, Shigella could send Toby into shock, which often leads to organ failure and occasionally even death. But at the same time, Dr. Miller was relieved. Although Shigella was obviously serious, it could be defeated with antibiotics, so she could finally start treating Toby. Dr. Miller told the attending nurse to prepare antibiotics for Toby and begin administering them as soon as they were ready. Then Dr. Miller rushed to Toby's room to give his parents the news. The boy was lying in his hospital bed with his eyes half open. His mother sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her son's hand and looking flushed and exhausted. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents to step outside with her so she could explain what was going on. But when Toby's mother tried to stand up, she wobbled and had to sit back down. She admitted she had not been feeling well since she woke up that morning. She said she even vomited a couple of times. Dr. Miller told Toby's mother to stay seated while she called for a nurse to prepare a bed for her. The doctor told her it was entirely possible that she was also now infected with Shigella, which was the bacteria that they had just discovered her son was infected with. After all, Shigella is so contagious that it can be passed in a handshake if someone who touched the bacteria didn't wash their hands well enough. As soon as Dr. Miller had settled Toby's mother into her own hospital bed, a receptionist waved the doctor down. It was the lab calling again. They had the results for Dr. Miller's other young patient, Peyton. She had Shigella too. Dr. Miller put down the phone. First Toby, then maybe Toby's mother, and now Peyton? Suddenly, Dr. Miller felt like she had an outbreak on her hands. And given how easily Shigella is transmitted, there were likely dozens more people out there suffering symptoms at home, and every one of those cases could make more people sick. Suddenly, Dr. Miller had a lot of calls to make. Later on that same afternoon in August of 1998, a young epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health named Dr. Julie Wickland was sitting at her desk when her secretary buzzed. She told her there was an urgent call coming in from a local hospital. Dr. Wickland was only in her 20s and still trying to prove herself professionally, but one thing she had already learned was that being an epidemiologist meant everything was a potential emergency. People's lives were always on the line. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Miller, who described the potential Shigella outbreak she was facing, 3 cases in her hospital, and likely a lot more people at home right now who just weren't sick enough to head to the hospital yet. But soon they would be. Once Dr. Wickland was done hearing from Dr. Miller, she requested to have Toby and Peyton's families fill out food history charts with everything they had eaten in the past 4 days. Then she met with her team at the Department of Health and assigned some of her best investigators to join her on this case. By the time she got back to her office, Dr. Wickland's secretary came in holding a stack of papers. The families had already filled out and faxed over their kids' food histories. Dr. Wickland spread them out on her desk and scanned them to look for commonalities. Right away, she noticed a pattern. They had all eaten at a restaurant called 𝗙𝗙𝗡𝗙𝗢𝗏. The odds were extremely low that both Toby and Peyton's families had eaten at the same place in the same 4-day window, especially considering how far apart they lived, and so this was exactly the type of breakthrough Dr. Wickland was hoping for. An hour later, Dr. Wickland and 2 other health officials stepped out of a dark sedan in front of the restaurant 𝗙𝗙𝗡𝗙, a modest neighborhood eatery. The manager was waiting for them by the entrance, looking very tense. The restaurant was temporarily closed for the rest of the day so that Dr. Wickland and her team could go and conduct their investigation there. Dr. Wickland needed to inspect every aspect of the restaurant's food handling for possible sources of contamination, such as spoiled food or dirty water. Dr. Wickland assigned one investigator to record the temperatures inside the refrigerators and freezers, while another investigator took water samples from all the sinks and taps. Then Dr. Wickland studied every step in the food's journey to the table, from the delivery area to the storage room to the food prep stations. The overall layout at 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏 met safety standards, but Dr. Wickland knew how elusive Shigella could be. Shigella can show up almost anywhere and then can be spread by the people who are simply preparing the food. Dr. Wickland told the manager she needed to interview the entire staff. And so once the staff was gathered in the dining room, Dr. Wickland circled the room, asking each employee questions about their recent health and also their daily kitchen routine. Several members of the staff admitted to Dr. Wickland that they had not been feeling very good lately. Some had even been feverish and suffering pretty severe abdominal pains. It sounded worryingly similar to what Toby and Toby's mother and Peyton were all experiencing. Dr. Wickland then made copies of the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts from the past 4 days. Flipping through the pages, she estimated at least 400 people had eaten at 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏 within a few days of when Dr. Miller's patients had eaten there. All of these diners were now at risk of getting Shigella. Back at the office, Dr. Wickland wrote up a questionnaire for all of 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏's 400-plus diners. She needed to determine how many other customers out there were suffering similar symptoms. If any of them had contracted Shigella but didn't realize it, they could be infecting other people. These people needed to be notified right away, or else this situation could get much worse. The next morning, when Dr. Wickland arrived at her office, she learned that one of 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏's employees had tested positive for Shigella. This confirmed that everyone who had eaten at the restaurant could now potentially be infected with the Shigella bacteria. But at least she now had a pretty good idea where the Shigella was coming from, a sick food prep worker who likely had not washed their hands properly. Dr. Wickland's first step was to call 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏s and order the restaurant temporarily closed until the Shigella outbreak was totally contained. Then Dr. Wickland called Dr. Miller to get an update on her patients. Dr. Miller told her that Toby's mom was doing fine, but Toby and Peyton were struggling. Shigella is always harshest on the young and the elderly, and the children's conditions were not getting better. If they didn't start getting better soon, Dr. Miller feared they could go into shock and die. Early the next day, Dr. Wickland's phone rang with new results from the lab. Several more employees at 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏's restaurant had tested positive for Shigella. This meant that the disease outbreak was not coming from a single unsanitary worker. It was coming from lots of places. Dr. Wickland got a fresh cup of coffee and then sat down at her desk to begin studying the first wave of questionnaire results from 𝗙𝗙𝗏𝗏's recent customers. And she was disturbed to see that a full half of the 400 diners reported experiencing symptoms that were consistent with Shigella. But as Dr. Wickland studied the responses, something about the data just didn't seem right. a large percentage of infected diners had eaten at Roberta's before any of the employees started to get sick. So it was unlikely that the employees were giving the infection to the customers. The workers were actually victims too. Dr. Wickland leaned back in her chair and took a deep, defeated breath. She now realized that she actually had no idea where all the Shigella cases were coming from. An hour later, the manager at Roberta's unlocked the restaurant door and let in Dr. Wickland. She told the team to put on gloves and start discarding every piece of food in the building. Nothing could be saved. Roberta's manager was happy to comply, and Dr. Wickland told him the business could reopen once all the food had been thrown away and the entire restaurant professionally cleaned. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Dr. Wickland pulled a bin of produce off a shelf and dumped it in the trash. The Shigella was somewhere under this roof, and Dr. Wickland was not going to let it slip past her. Dr. Wickland returned to her office at the Department of Health to find a report sitting on her desk. Her heart sank. It was the details of another case of Shigella, this time north of Minneapolis. A 33-year-old woman had been rushed to a hospital after hours of vomiting, fever, and diarrhea. The night before, the woman had eaten at an upscale restaurant in her neighborhood called Marty's. Not only that, but she'd gone to the restaurant with multiple friends, all of whom had been contacted and reported feeling sick. But Marty's restaurant was very far from Roberta's. For this illness to strike two restaurants in entirely different areas, miles apart from one another, was extremely rare. Dr. Wickland sighed and called the manager at Marty's to tell them the restaurant would have to close until further notice. She said that a health official would be there shortly to collect their reservation list and credit card receipts, and all their recent diners would need to be contacted about the disease outbreak. Dr. Wickland then called a meeting with her investigators to brainstorm. She felt lucky that there had been no fatalities so far, but she also knew that young children were in the greatest danger. She told her team they had to find the link between Marty's restaurant and Roberta's restaurant that could explain all the Shigella cases. Maybe both restaurants sourced particular food items from the same place, or maybe an employee worked part-time at both restaurants, or maybe they shared a water supplier. Whatever it was, she told her team they had to go find out. By the next afternoon, Dr. Wickland had more information to go on. She and her team had worked around the clock, contacting people and compiling timelines of symptoms. It was a lot to sift through, but she knew it was always better to have too much information rather than not enough. As Dr. Wickland made her way through all the paper piled on her desk, the differences between the two restaurants really jumped out at her. Marty's got its water from a different reservoir than Roberta's, so this was not a water issue. There was also almost zero overlap in their menus because Roberta's and Marty's served very different types of food. And a review of the two restaurants' employees showed that no staff members worked in both places either. The researchers could not even identify a single food that all the sick customers at each restaurant had eaten. Everyone ordered different dishes, yet got sick the same way. And so Dr. Wickland wondered to herself, how could that be? This just doesn't seem possible. Just then, the phone rang. It was the lab with an update on the Marty's restaurant customers. Everyone who tested had come back positive for Shigella. The lab had also done a genetic comparison of the Shigella bacteria from the Marty's diners and the Roberta's diners, and they found them to be identical. Clearly, both restaurants had been contaminated by the same source. Dr. Wickland thanked the technician and hung up. She felt stumped, exhausted, and ready to call it quits for the day, but she did have a couple more calls to make. The first one just to check up on Toby and Peyton. On the other end of the line, Dr. Miller sounded equally exhausted. She said Toby was still bedridden because his body was not responding to the antibiotics. He was now faced with a painful and slow recovery. Little Peyton Egger was even worse. Dr. Miller had nurses monitoring her around the clock, but her family was obviously worried sick. Dr. Wickland thanked her for the update, then she hung up and scrolled through her Rolodex until she found the United States Centers for Disease Control. This outbreak was clearly not settling down the way Dr. Wickland hoped it would, and so it was time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Timothy 𝗙𝗡𝗡 was in his office packing up to head home when his phone rang. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but his position as an epidemic intelligence officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had taught him the danger of missing an emergency call. So he picked up the phone and he listened carefully as Dr. Wickland explained the events of the past week and how the Shigella outbreak showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. Wickland said she needed the CDC's help in finding the outbreak's origin so they could stop it. Every bacterial outbreak has its own genetic fingerprint that makes it unique, and the CDC keeps a massive database of these fingerprints from all over the world. Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡 told Dr. Wickland to email him an image of the Shigella bacteria's DNA profile. Then he could use the CDC's database to see if the same Shigella strain had been reported anywhere else. The moment Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡 uploaded the Shigella bacteria from Minnesota to his database, Shigella outbreaks in other areas popped up all over, from Los Angeles County to Boston to Florida, plus up in Canada, in Alberta and Ontario. Each outbreak had been linked to a specific restaurant, and all were genetically identical. This meant that there was a good chance all of these Shigella outbreaks were caused by the same source of contamination. The sheer breadth of locations baffled Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡. He stared at the map. How did the same contaminant spread across both coasts, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up into Canada? He emailed his coworkers the results and asked them to help him contact every restaurant associated with an outbreak and compile a comprehensive list of foods and ingredients on their menus. There had to be something in common to all of them that was carrying this particular strain of Shigella. The next morning, one of Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡's fellow investigators strolled into his office and handed him a Post-it note with one word written on it. Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡 read the note and couldn't help but laugh. The investigators had identified the probable source of the Shigella outbreak, and it was something that no one suspected. Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡's department even had a term for this particular ingredient. They called it stealth food, because it's used in a wide variety of dishes, yet usually goes unnoticed. Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡 congratulated his team. This was the best lead they had. He picked up a phone and he called a colleague at the Food and Drug Administration named Jeremy Brown. Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗡𝗡 told Jeremy what they had discovered and said he'd need the FDA's help tracing this particular ingredient, the stealth food, to the original supplier. Global supply chains for restaurants are incredibly complex, with foods shipping from across the world and constantly being reprocessed and repackaged, and so finding one bad batch of food among all of that would not be easy. Jeremy said he would get to work. A few days later, Jeremy rode in a Jeep through Ensenada, Mexico. At first, the countryside was dry and dusty, but as they curved over a hillside, suddenly everything turned green. For miles into the distance, Jeremy saw nothing but crops in organized rows. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road and passed a sign that said the name of the farm, Valle Verde. The farmhand pointed out different fields of produce, including tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuces, all watered by massive irrigation machines. But the biggest spread of all was an entire 55-acre parcel devoted to growing nothing but the stealth food Jeremy had come to investigate. And the stealth food was parsley. At some point between when it was harvested and when it was shipped, this parsley was becoming contaminated with Shigella bacteria. Jeremy was not going to leave the farm until he found out where and how this was happening. The Jeep came to a stop on the banks of an old riverbed. Since tainted water is the most common cause of Shigella, Jeremy had requested to visit the farm's water supply first. The farmhand hopped out and led them to a series of wells that provided all of the farm's water. Jeremy looked inside one of them. The stone casing was old, but uncracked. The shaft was dug very deep, so that the water came from far underground, which meant the likelihood of contamination was actually quite small. Jeremy could tell the issue was not the wells. Next, the farmhand drove them past several meadows to a reservoir that served as the farm's backup water supply. It looked like a small fresh lake. The water seemed clean, but Jeremy still bottled up a couple of samples for testing back in the US. The farmhand asked Jeremy where he wanted to head next. Jeremy said he could use a break from the heat. It had gotten much hotter as the afternoon wore on. A few minutes later, the Jeep rumbled to a stop in front of a huge farm shed with a corrugated steel roof. It contained long conveyor belts stacked with crates of parsley. At the end of the line, men took those crates and stacked them on a pallet and then hosed them down with chilled water from a machine called a hydro cooler. Jeremy watched as hundreds of boxes quickly piled up and were loaded into the backs of huge trucks and then driven away to be shipped all across North America. Jeremy asked the farmhand if the water for the hydro cooler came from their wells or the reservoir, but the farmhand shook his head and said neither. The water for the hydro cooler came from Ensenada's municipal water supply. Jeremy put on his sunglasses and told the farmhand that that was where he needed to go next. At the municipal water plant, the facilities director admitted that they had been a bit overwhelmed lately. Due to government funding cutbacks, they had been understaffed for a while. With fewer security guards to watch the place, there had been a few break-ins lately, and some equipment had even been damaged. At one of the water filtration systems, Jeremy noticed that the machine that normally disinfects the water with chlorine was shut down. Jeremy asked the manager if the chlorinator had just been turned off today or if it really was not working at all. The manager shook his head in frustration and said this had been on their list to get fixed for over a month, but the city hadn't managed to send over the parts yet. Jeremy did his best to hide his shock. Without chlorine, all sorts of contaminants could flourish in the water, including Shigella. From there, the water was pumped to businesses, homes, and farms all over the area, like the parsley crop at Valle Verde. Jeremy filled several bottles to be tested and told the farmhand it was time to go. Days later, Jeremy got his results. Ensenada's municipal water was loaded with Shigella. And it was the same strain as the one found at Roberta's, Marty's, and all the other restaurants. The contaminated water had been sprayed directly onto the parsley right before being shipped to restaurants all across North America where people like Toby, Peyton, and their families ate the parsley without giving it a second thought. Jeremy knew they had been lucky in tracking down the source relatively quickly. He estimated that as many as 1,000 diners had caught Shigella from one harvest of contaminated parsley, but it could have been so much worse. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, and both Toby and Peyton eventually made full recoveries. But very few of those who got sick will ever look at their parsley garnish the same. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. On a humid summer morning in June 1999, 36-year-old 𝗙𝗔𝗡 was hard at work on a farm outside of Nagpur, a city in central India. The sun had just risen, and the air was already so hot that he found it hard to breathe. Sanju and a group of farmhands were hard at work tending to the soybean crops. He made his way through the field, stopping to catch his breath every few steps. Sanju moved a lot slower than his coworkers because of his massive belly. For the past 15 years, Sanju had struggled beneath the weight of his ever-growing stomach. At first, when he was in his early 20s, His family had thought he was just filling out a little, like all young men do when they become adults. But Sanju's stomach didn't stop growing. It kept getting bigger and bigger until it had swelled to the size of a massive watermelon. But his arms and legs stayed stick thin. He never understood why his belly kept growing since he didn't eat much. By the time Sanju reached his early 30s, he was in constant pain, and his family desperately wanted him to see a doctor. But he couldn't afford to take time off of work. Although, deep down, he had to admit he was a little scared of what the doctor might find. Sanju wiped the sweat from his eyes and told himself to keep moving. As he shoveled, he overheard another farmhand make a nasty joke about maternity clothes. A few men laughed. People liked to joke that he looked pregnant. Sanju had been relentlessly teased about his so-called pregnancy for years. His neighbors and his old childhood friends would point and laugh at him. He knew he should be used to it by now, but it still upset him. But his belly wasn't just a source of embarrassment for Sanju. The sheer weight of his stomach made even the simplest things, like getting up from a chair or bending over, very hard to do. Even now, as he pushed himself to keep up with the other men in the field, he could feel his back stiffening and his arms and shoulders aching. By midday, he felt ready to drop from physical exhaustion. The sun beat down on Sanju's head and he could feel his chest tighten. He tried to keep working, but today it was harder to breathe than usual. No matter how deeply he inhaled, he couldn't quite catch his breath. Finally, he dropped his shovel and doubled over, gasping for air. Sanju gathered what little strength he had left and stood up straight. He could feel other farm workers' eyes on him as he gathered his tools and headed home. It was the longest walk of Sanju's life. He felt humiliated and useless, but he was also afraid. He could barely take a breath. By the time he got to the small home he shared with his family, he nearly fell through the front door. The last thing he remembered was falling hard on the tile floor. Sanju's mother was fixing lunch in the kitchen when she heard a noise in the front of the house. She ran into the living room and found her son collapsed on the floor. She grabbed the phone and called an ambulance, then rushed to Sanju's side and knelt down beside him. She tried to roll him over on his back so he could breathe better, but it was very difficult because of his enormous stomach. She muttered every prayer she could think of, straining her ears for the sound of a siren. And finally, in the distance, she heard it. By the time the ambulance pulled up in front of their home, Sanju was barely breathing. The paramedics quickly assessed Sanju's condition. They put an oxygen mask on him, then strapped him to a gurney and loaded him up into an ambulance. Sanju's mother wanted to go with him, but the nearest major hospital was in Mumbai, an 11-hour drive from Nagpur. All she could do was watch as the ambulance sped away with her son. Early the next morning, Dr. 𝗙𝗡 𝗙𝗢𝗓 had just started his shift in the oncology ward at Tata Memorial Hospital. He was alerted that a new patient named Sanju Bhagat had been brought in all the way from Nagpur and that he needed to be seen right away. Dr. Mehta hurried over to Sanju's room. If someone was rushed in an ambulance from so far away, it had to be a serious emergency. As soon as Dr. Mehta examined Sanju's giant swollen belly, he instructed the nurse to prepare the operating room for surgery. Dr. Mehta was a specialist in tumor removal, and he was certain that Sanju had a massive tumor in his stomach, possibly the biggest one he'd ever seen. The tumor was likely pressing against Sanju's diaphragm, which was why he couldn't breathe. And given how big it was, and Sanju's weakened condition, the tumor had to be removed immediately. While another nurse prepped Sanju for the operation, Dr. Mehta gathered his surgical team and headed to the operating room. As they sterilized their hands and put on clean scrubs, Dr. Mehta warned them that the tumor's sheer size would make this a very challenging operation. There was a risk of damaging the soft tissue in Sanju's stomach, his nerve endings, or blood vessels. In the worst case, the surgery could cause severe internal bleeding or even death. A few minutes later, Sanju was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. Once he was under anesthesia, Dr. Mehta called for a scalpel. He placed one hand on Sanju's stomach for leverage, Then he cut into Sanju's belly. After the blade broke through Sanju's skin and opened up his chest area, Dr. 𝗙𝗏 expected to see blood and a bright red mass of cancerous cells. Instead, gallons of thick, yellowish fluid gushed from Sanju's stomach, spilling onto the floor. The entire surgical team gasped. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 jumped out of the way, trying to avoid the surge of bile. It had a foul odor that made everyone in the room start to gag. Nurses ran toward him with towels, trying to sop up the putrid-smelling liquid. While they cleaned up the mess, Dr. 𝗙𝗏 remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. At first, all he felt was thick jelly-like fluid sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed something unusual. His eyes went wide as he dove a little deeper. His palm wrapped around something soft, but with a brittle core. He realized this was not a tumor. Whatever was in Sanju's stomach had bones, a lot of them. Dr. 𝗙𝗏's jaw dropped as his hand explored the object floating in Sanju's stomach. He grabbed onto one of the tiny bones and began to slowly pull it up and out of Sanju's stomach. As he lifted the bizarre object into the air, he could hear more gasps from everyone in the room. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 could hardly believe his eyes. What he was looking at shouldn't be possible. He had never seen anything like this in his entire medical career. He placed it on a medical tray for analysis and turned back to Sanju. Thankfully, he had survived the operation, but Dr. 𝗙𝗏 couldn't help but speculate how something so strange could have gotten inside of Sanju. A few hours later, Sanju awoke in a hospital bed. His stomach was sore, but when he moved his hand to grasp his belly, he looked down in shock. The giant lump was gone. He ran his hand over his flat stomach. He hadn't seen it like this in almost 20 years. He took a deep breath and smiled as he felt his chest expand. He couldn't believe he could breathe again without any pain. Just then, Dr. 𝗙𝗏 appeared in the doorway to Sanju's room with a very serious look on his face. He confirmed that the surgery was a success, but as Dr. 𝗙𝗏 explained what they had found inside of his body, the smile slowly faded from Sanju's face. The object Dr. 𝗙𝗏 had removed from Sanju's stomach was a ball of pink flesh with a tuft of dark brown hair growing along one side. 2 fully formed feet protruded from either end. In the middle was the beginning of a jawline. But what Dr. 𝗙𝗏 couldn't forget was the fully formed human hand that was attached to this ball of flesh. It was what he had grasped in a gruesome handshake when he lowered his hand into Sanju's stomach. The hand had fingernails protruding from it. The nails were so overgrown they almost looked like tiny claws. A grayish-yellow tube grew out of the center of the fleshy mass, connecting it to Sanju's stomach. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 told Sanju that the surgical staff had witnessed one of the rarest medical conditions on Earth. In a way, Sanju had been pregnant, not for the 16 years that his belly was protruding, but since before he was even born. The hairy, mutated lump he had removed was Sanju's twin. Sanju was a victim of an incredibly rare condition called fetus in fetu, which means fetus in fetus. When Sanju and his twin were first conceived, they started out as identical twins, which is when a single fertilized egg splits into 2 embryos. But something went wrong during that division, and the cells that became Sanju's twin latched onto his embryo. As Sanju developed, his body formed around the twin cells, which in turn fed off his bloodstream. This twin did not have a functional brain or heart, so it wasn't alive in the traditional sense. But as Sanju grew, so did his twin. It fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach like a parasite, using the yellowish tube as an umbilical cord. If Dr. 𝗙𝗢 hadn't eventually removed it from Sanju's stomach, it would have gotten so big that it would have killed Sanju. Sanju recovered physically from the surgery in just a few weeks, but when he returned to Nagpur, he was upset to find that his neighbors still made fun of him. Word had spread in the news about what had been inside of his stomach. Instead of calling him pregnant, now he was the man who gave birth to his brother. After his surgery, Sanju refused to allow doctors to follow up with his case. He never wanted a reminder that he had carried a dead twin inside of his belly. The next and final story is called One by One. In the spring of 1862, a man in London, England, named Richard Turner, sat on his son's bed. He held the sick little boy in his arms and spooned some medicine into his mouth. The child swallowed it and then let out a painful cough. Richard's wife, Elizabeth, who was standing by his side, looked at her husband with alarm. It had been a horrific few months for Richard. Worst of all, there was no cure. All the doctors could do was administer a variety of tonics and hope they would reduce the symptoms enough for the patient's body to fight off the disease on its own. The Turners had brought in doctors to try and save their children, but nothing the physicians tried had worked. Now all Richard and Elizabeth could do was watch helplessly as their third child got paler and weaker from the lack of oxygen. The little boy became delirious and drifted in and out of consciousness. Thomas Orton. If anyone could help their child get better, it was him. The next morning, Richard made his way to the hospital where Dr. Orton practiced. He managed to meet with him and begged the doctor for his help. Initially, Dr. Orton was resistant to the idea. He was extremely busy, and since there was no cure for diphtheria, he was skeptical that he'd actually be able to help them. But Richard would not give up. He pleaded with the doctor to please help what was left of his family. Their daughter's life was at stake. Dr. Orton was moved. He nodded as he shook Richard's hand, and he agreed to help them. The next morning, on April 3rd, 1862, Dr. Orton packed his medical bag and left for the Turner home. The family lived in the Limehouse district, which was one of London's poorest neighborhoods. He wasn't shocked that sickness was prevalent there. The 1800s were a dark time for the entire city. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a crowded, polluted mess. No matter where you went, it was difficult to escape the stink of raw sewage. Factories spewed toxic black smoke which permanently lingered in the air as a thick haze. Dr. Orton's carriage sped through the dense crowds, past beggars holding out hands for money, many of whom were children. Across the River Thames, trash and dead fish lined the banks. In the Limehouse neighborhood, conditions were even worse. Dr. Orton placed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth to minimize the foul smell of animal waste and rotten food that seemed to be everywhere. When the carriage finally arrived at the Turners' home, Dr. Orton stepped down onto the narrow sidewalk, then he walked to their door, braced himself, and knocked. Richard Turner opened it, looking exhausted and ashen-faced, but he lit up at the sight of this doctor and welcomed him inside. Once Dr. Orton entered the tiny front parlor, he was pleasantly surprised. The home was like an oasis in this hellish neighborhood. It was clean, warm, and well-kept. The Turners brought him into the children's room. A few toys were scattered about on the floor. Colorful drawings hung on bright green wallpaper, and fresh plants were perched on the dresser. Little Anne Amelia sat slumped on the bed against a pillow, covered in heavy blankets. She barely stirred when they entered. Her head hung to the side and her eyes were glassy. Dr. Orton could hear her struggling to breathe. The doctor opened his leather bag and got to work examining the child. He pulled out a tongue depressor and asked Anne Amelia to open her mouth as wide as she could. When he looked inside to the back of her throat, he was surprised. He couldn't see any signs of a thick gray membrane normally caused by diphtheria. This was unusual, but it also meant that the disease clearly had not progressed as far as he had feared. With treatment, maybe he had time to suppress her symptoms and give her body time to heal itself. He spoon-fed her some opium tincture to ease her discomfort and showed Mrs. Turner how to rub ointment made from coal tar on her daughter's chest. Then he shared his findings with Richard and his wife. He hoped he had gotten to 𝗙𝗙𝗎𝗓's symptoms in time before the diphtheria overwhelmed her. Dr. Orton could see relief wash over the parents' faces. Now all they could do was wait. Over the next 2 weeks, 𝗙𝗙𝗎𝗓 did not improve. Even though Dr. Orton checked in on her and her parents tended to her night and day, she still became even weaker. And just before the end of April, the 3-year-old died. The Turners were destroyed. Their entire family had been wiped out in less than 2 months. Dr. Orton's heart broke for them. He felt frustrated and angry. He couldn't get little 𝗙𝗎𝗎𝗓's case out of his head. Something just didn't seem right. The day after 𝗙𝗎𝗎𝗓's death, Dr. Orton sat in his office, poring through his notes. He struggled to make sense of what had happened. Every other doctor the Turners had hired had diagnosed the children with diphtheria, and all signs did point to that being the disease they all had. Except 𝗙𝗎𝗎𝗓's throat had never developed the thick membrane that normally came with diphtheria. Dr. Orton couldn't shake the feeling that something else had killed her and potentially had killed her siblings. It was a crazy thought, but if it was true, that could explain why no one else in their neighborhood had caught the highly contagious disease. Perhaps what killed the Turner children wasn't contagious after all. Dr. Orton was anxious to get more information from the Turners. So just after 𝗙𝗎𝗓's passing, the doctor returned to their house. Despite their overwhelming grief, the 2 parents welcomed Dr. Orton inside, and they sat together at the kitchen table. He asked them if anything had changed recently at home. He was curious whether they had eaten any new foods or maybe met new people in the area, but the parents said no, nothing has changed. Then the doctor asked if he could check their water source. At that time, families in the Limehouse district retrieved their water from pumps located on the street. People would have to queue up with buckets or tubs and haul whatever they could back home. The doctor inspected the water, and while it was far from clean, he couldn't imagine that it was the cause of their tragedy. And if it was, he didn't understand why other families weren't afflicted as well. Dr. Orton asked the Turners to think of anything else that might have changed in the last several months. Anything. Mr. Turner paused and said the only thing he could think of had happened around Christmas. They had saved enough money to buy the kids some new blankets and toys. They had even redecorated their room. The holiday season had been festive and happy, and their good cheer continued into the new year. But then, in February, everything changed. That was when their oldest child fell sick. It happened so fast, and it seemed to come from nowhere. Since then, their lives had been a nightmare. Dr. Orton listened quietly, frustrated that he couldn't glean any clues from what the Turners were sharing. He thanked them as he got up from the table, and then asked if he might take one more look inside the children's room. Richard and his wife nodded. As he walked through the empty room, everything looked the same. The toys were still on the floor, the bed had the same blankets neatly pulled back. Then the doctor's eyes flickered past the pictures on one side of the wall, and that's when he saw something that he had not noticed before. A few hours later, Dr. Orton was sitting at a table in a dimly lit pub just around the corner from his office. Across the table from him was Dr. Henry 𝗙𝗎𝗓, who was a professor of chemistry and taught at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the London Hospital. As they sipped whiskey, Dr. Orton told him about the diphtheria diagnosis of the Turner children. He described how none of the treatments had improved 𝗙𝗎𝗓's symptoms. Then he described how her throat had never been scarred by the leathery membrane that was so common in diphtheria. Dr. 𝗙𝗎𝗓 agreed that a number of things seemed suspicious, but if it wasn't diphtheria, he had no idea what else could have happened. That's when Dr. Orton shared what he had seen in the children's bedroom and why he thought it could explain the tragedy that had fallen on the Turners. Dr. 𝗙𝗎𝗓 thought it was a long shot, but he was intrigued by Orton's theory, and he agreed to help him test it. 𝗙𝗡𝗙𝗢 had not been buried yet, so the next day, Dr. Orton ordered a tissue sample to be taken from her body. Then he sent that sample to Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗙 for analysis. In the meantime, he ran some tests of his own on the unusual thing that he had discovered in the children's bedroom. A few days later, Dr. 𝗙𝗡𝗙 and Dr. Orton compared notes. They now understood the cause for the rapid and tragic deaths of the 4 Turner children, and it was not diphtheria. It all started just before Christmas. Richard and his wife wanted to make the children's room as festive as possible to celebrate the holiday season. So one Saturday, they decided to shop for new wallpaper and selected a pattern that the whole family loved. It was intricate and beautiful, and best of all, it was a stunningly bright green. The color was actually called 𝗙𝗙𝗡, named after the designer. The shopkeeper told them it was a top seller at their store. When Richard put the paper up on the walls, the room was transformed. The 4 children were overjoyed. In fact, they were so mesmerized by the vivid green wallpaper, they tore off little pieces to play with. Sometimes they would lick it like candy. But what neither the children nor the parents realized was that there was actually a special ingredient in the dye. This ingredient helped to create that very bright green that they all loved so much, and this special ingredient made its way into the children's bodies and traveled through their bloodstreams. It saturated their lungs and caused fluid and mucus to build until one by one, it killed each child. That special ingredient was a deadly poison called arsenic. When Dr. Orton had returned to the children's room days before, he noticed that pieces of the wallpaper were missing. After questioning the Turners about the reason, and them saying their kids were ripping them off and licking them, and then after running tests on 𝗙𝗡𝗙𝗢's stomach and then the wallpaper itself, the mystery was solved. At that time, arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, from women's makeup to children's toys to dye for all sorts of fabric, and it was in low enough doses that at the time it was considered safe to touch. But that brand of wallpaper was the exception. Word soon spread across England about what happened to the Turner children. Dr. Orton's discovery sparked a national outrage, and concerned parents protested for the wallpaper to be banned. Dr. Orton campaigned for years until eventually the manufacturing of arsenic-based dyes was stopped. Thanks to 𝗙𝗡𝗙𝗢, many children's lives were saved. On a hot fall morning in 1998, a 57-year-old cabinet maker named 𝗙𝗙𝗡 𝗙𝗡𝗙 stood outside of his shop in a rural Malaysian village, waiting for a friend to pick up an order. 𝗙𝗙𝗡𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 swatted away mosquitoes and looked down the road. His friend, Ash, was an hour late. He had promised to be there when the shop opened, but there was still no sign of him. In front of his workshop, 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 could see an orchard that grew durian, which is a popular fruit in Southeast Asia. Next to the orchard, another farm raised hundreds of pigs. Their familiar grunting echoed through the dense canopy of trees. Nearly everyone in town made a living as farmers, and 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 could smell the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil and manure in the humid air. 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 eyed the empty road again and turned back to his shop. He didn't have a phone, otherwise he would have called to see where Ash was. But until Ash showed up, 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 was content to go back to his work while his dogs ran in and out of the workshop. But as the hours ticked by, 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 started to think that his friend might not come to pick up his cabinets at all. Finally, as 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 prepared to close up at the end of the day, a messenger arrived with a note from Ash. He had a headache and he was vomiting, so he wasn't able to go anywhere. 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 thanked the messenger and then finished closing up his shop and then started walking home with his dogs. The sun was setting over the lush green valley and he could just barely see bats fluttering in the durian trees. 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 was worried about his sick friend. The symptoms he listed were painfully familiar. There was a serious illness going around this town that the local doctors called Japanese encephalitis. Other people had become so sick that they couldn't move or speak, and still others had seizures and went into comas. 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 prayed that Ash wouldn't be one of the unlucky ones. As 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙 kept walking down the road, he saw a giant truck slowly drive by that was billowing white fog into the air behind it. 𝗙𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗏𝗡 had read that the Malaysian government was spraying the area to kill mosquitoes, which was how Japanese encephalitis was spread. The sight of the truck made 𝗙𝗏𝗡 feel a little more at ease. Once the mosquitoes were gone, the disease would go away too. The next day, 𝗙𝗏𝗡 spent the morning painting cabinets and playing fetch with his 2 dogs. Later in the afternoon, he heard a car rumbling down the road, and he looked up hopefully. The road wasn't usually very busy, and he'd checked every car that passed to see if it was Ash. But as this car got closer, he could see that it was the same messenger from the day before. The messenger pulled up and then got out of the car and walked up to 𝗙𝗏𝗡's shop. His expression was grim as he handed 𝗙𝗏𝗡 the paper with the message. This time, it was written by Ash's wife. 𝗙𝗏𝗡's heart sank as he read. Ash had been taken to the hospital, but he was too sick, and the doctors there couldn't help him. He had died from this Japanese encephalitis. 𝗙𝗏𝗡 felt a sense of dread. He'd known how dangerous the disease was, but now that his friend was dead, it felt much more real. He hurried back to his shop and called his dogs inside. Then he closed the door. 𝗙𝗏𝗡 realized that he hadn't been taking the disease seriously enough. Now he was determined to do whatever was necessary to avoid being bit by a mosquito, even if that meant staying inside basically all the time and shutting down his business for a while. The government was spraying pesticides to kill all the mosquitoes, but 𝗙𝗏𝗡 knew the insects would not disappear completely. Several months later, on February 27, 1999, a young scientist named 𝗙𝗏𝗡 steadied his hands as he swabbed a viral culture onto a petri dish. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 was studying virology at the University of Malaya Medical Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's largest city. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 was investigating the outbreak of a disease that the government had been calling Japanese encephalitis. Roughly 200 people in Malaysia had gotten sick so far, and close to 100 had been admitted to Dr. 𝗙𝗏's hospital. Most of them exhibited the same symptoms: swelling of the brain, which led to an inability to talk or walk. Many of the patients became fully paralyzed or fell into comas. The fatality rate was staggering. 2 out of every 5 people who became infected died, making the outbreak almost as lethal as the bubonic plague, which wiped out a third of Europe's entire population during the Middle Ages. Dr. 𝗙𝗏's university had conducted a variety of tests to confirm that all the sick patients were positive for Japanese encephalitis. However, the results of these tests were inconclusive. There were at least a few researchers who felt they couldn't be exactly sure what was making all these people sick. However, the symptoms were highly similar to Japanese encephalitis, and there were no other known diseases in the area that could explain the outbreak. But Dr. 𝗙𝗏 was uncomfortable settling on this sort of uncertain evidence. He had a nagging feeling that there was something else going on. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 was also getting mounting pressure from his lab director to come up with better answers soon. Right now, the government was investing all its efforts in killing mosquitoes. But what if this outbreak wasn't being spread by mosquitoes after all? One of Dr. 𝗙𝗏's colleagues, who had been studying the question of which people were most likely to get sick, had pointed out an interesting fact. No Muslims had been infected with this virus, even though Islam is Malaysia's leading religion. This was strange because Japanese encephalitis is transmitted through mosquito bites, and there was no reason why people of a particular religion would be immune to mosquitoes. This made Dr. 𝗙𝗏 even more skeptical that the patients they were studying had Japanese encephalitis. So he decided to run his own tests. He was going to isolate the disease right there in his lab so he could get a better look at it. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 hand-selected cerebrospinal fluid and serum samples from patients whose symptoms most closely resembled Japanese encephalitis. Then he put each one in a sealed dish and tucked it into an incubator that warmed it to the temperature of a human body, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Then 𝗙𝗏 waited. He hoped that the warmed-up fluid samples would create the perfect environment for the disease to show itself. If successful, Dr. 𝗙𝗏 would eventually be able to cultivate highly concentrated and highly lethal dishes full of the disease that he could study. Nearly 1 week later, Dr. 𝗙𝗏 pulled the cultures from the incubator. While the samples had been incubating, 5 more patients had been admitted to a nearby hospital with the same deadly symptoms. Their fluid samples were sent to Dr. 𝗙𝗧's department. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 knew that every second counted. If this disease was not Japanese encephalitis, and Dr. 𝗙𝗧 was able to identify what it really was, then doctors might be able to find a cure and save everyone who was already sick. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 slid the samples under his microscope and then stooped down to look through the eyepiece. His experiment with the incubator had worked. The dish was jammed full of invading microbes. But when this virus was exposed to animal cells, the nature of its deadly effect was unexpected. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 wasn't sure what he was looking at, but it definitely was not Japanese encephalitis. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 knew he needed to show his boss, who was the head of the department at the university, right away, and so Dr. 𝗙𝗧 sprinted out the door to find him. 20 minutes later, Dr. 𝗙𝗧's boss was examining the same culture under the microscope. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 stood nearby, his stomach churning with anxiety. He knew his finding was significant, and they could save lives if they acted fast. But after a long moment, Dr. 𝗙𝗧's boss finally stood and just shook his head. He interpreted the results differently and didn't see enough evidence to prove that the virus was new. He argued that the virus's strange behavior could be due to normal variations in the culture, or even that the culture could be contaminated. He still believed that the results were consistent with this being Japanese encephalitis. He told Dr. 𝗙𝗧 to throw the sample away. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 was shocked. He knew that his experiment was not contaminated, but he also knew better than to outright challenge his superior. However, Dr. 𝗙𝗧 knew he could not back down completely. There was too much at stake. He just needed to find the right moment to convince his boss. 4 days later, on March 9th, Dr. 𝗙𝗧 got his chance. He was driving with his boss and 2 other colleagues returning from a meeting. The rain was coming down in sheets, and their car was inching forward in heavy traffic. It gave Dr. 𝗙𝗧 a captive audience. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 glanced at the men and then leaned forward in his seat, making sure he had his boss's attention. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 cleared his throat and then quickly launched into his theory. He emphasized the virus's unique effect on animal cells and said the variation was enough to prove that they were dealing with something unknown. The disease they were fighting was caused by an entirely new virus, he said, and they needed to take action immediately. The sickness had already spread to several other Malaysian states and hopped the border into Singapore. As Dr. 𝗙𝗧 described his findings, his colleagues' expressions showed signs of concern, but Dr. 𝗙𝗧's boss remained neutral. He pressed on, explaining that while he was sure they had discovered a new virus, their lab's equipment was not yet powerful enough to identify it. He argued that they really needed to send the cultures to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. The CDC had the right equipment, and it was in their best interest to help. This wasn't simply an outbreak affecting people in Malaysia. It had the potential to become a global pandemic with devastating consequences if they didn't control it quickly. The air in the car was thick with tension as Dr. 𝗙𝗧 waited for his boss to react. Finally, his boss cleared his throat and spoke. Dr. 𝗙𝗧's theory had merit, he said, and he would think about it overnight. Then the car they were in pulled up to Dr. 𝗙𝗧's boss's home, and his boss climbed out and walked away in the pouring rain. The next morning, Dr. 𝗙𝗧 woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. It was his boss. He told Dr. 𝗙𝗧 that he'd made some calls, and a travel visa was being expedited for Dr. 𝗙𝗧 to get to the United States. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 was so relieved, and he thanked his boss, and then he rushed to the hospital to prepare the virus samples for a trip to America. Four days later, Dr. 𝗙𝗧 stood in the CDC's research lab in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. 𝗙𝗧 peered through a powerful electron microscope at his slides. This awesome device was literally thousands of times better than anything Dr. 𝗙𝗧 was using at magnifying samples, giving 𝗙𝗧 a much more intimate look at his adversary. Underneath the lens of the microscope, his virus cultures revealed tiny ring-like formations covering the slide. He blinked and looked again to make sure. Now, Dr. 𝗙𝗧 knew for certain that the scientists in Malaysia had misidentified the virus. But Dr. 𝗙𝗧 did not feel excitement or pride that he had been right. Instead, at that moment, he felt terror. The type of virus on that slide was far deadlier than Japanese encephalitis, and it wasn't spread by mosquitoes. But, based on the virus's unique characteristics, Dr. Chua was almost positive he knew what was spreading it. He needed to report his findings immediately. Dr. Chua flagged down one of the CDC's scientists and asked for the nearest telephone. After he finished his call to his boss in Malaysia, he showed his discovery to CDC officials. They were instantly alarmed and agreed with Dr. Chua's assessment. The outbreak in Malaysia had the potential to kill millions of people. Back in Malaysia, a few days after Dr. Chua's discovery, the 57-year-old cabinet maker, 𝗙𝗙𝗡 watched from the doorway of his workshop as soldiers put up barricades at the end of the main road in his town. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 was staying inside as much as possible to avoid the mosquitoes that he believed were carrying this virus. The only time he went outside was to run between his home and his shop. By now, it seemed like almost every family in town had lost a loved one to this terrible disease. They'd all died painful and horrifying deaths, and residents were in a panic. The disease was showing no signs of slowing down either, and so the government was barricading the road into town to keep residents there quarantined. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 had lived here his entire life, and he couldn't remember any other time when travel in or out of the area had been restricted. The road was usually bustling with people going to and from work at this time of the day, but now it was deserted. The only sound was the fluttering of these red banners that people hung outside of their houses to ward off death. The silence frightened 𝗙𝗙𝗡. Even his dogs seemed different. Instead of jumping around and playing with their ball, they curled up quietly on the floor. And then, as 𝗙𝗙𝗡 was watching all this strangeness unfold in front of him, 𝗙𝗙𝗡 began to hear the sound of gunshots. When 𝗙𝗙𝗡 heard these gunshots, he instinctively hid behind his counter. Once it stopped, 𝗙𝗙𝗡 stood up and slowly opened his front door to see what was going on outside. And what he saw was a group of soldiers with rifles slung across their backs, marching out from behind a farm down the road and heading towards the next one. Also, there were all these military vehicles full of dozens more soldiers that were driving down the road, and they were all heading for different farms. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 watched as some of the soldiers stopped in front of the farm right across the street, and they went around to the back of the property. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 stepped out of his store to get a better look, and he peered around the corner of the farm across the street, and he could see the soldiers now pointing their rifles towards the trees, and also the pig pens below the trees. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 knew what was coming next, and he couldn't bear to watch it. He ran back to the doorway of his shop, and then a few moments later, he heard more gunfire and the terrible sound of pigs squealing in agony. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 could literally smell the coppery stench of blood as it wafted through the thick hot air. And then moments later, the soldiers emerged from behind the farm and began marching down the street towards the next farm. And the farm's owner from across the street followed the soldiers out onto the road, and the owner just sat down on the sidewalk and put his face in his hands. Once the soldiers had marched down the road and were gone, 𝗙𝗙𝗡 hustled across the street and knelt down next to the farmer who still had his face in his hands. After making sure this farmer was okay, 𝗙𝗙𝗡 gently asked, what happened? What's going on? And the farmer just shook his head in disbelief, and in a shaky voice, he told 𝗙𝗙𝗡 that the government had issued an order for all the pigs in this village to be slaughtered and buried. They told him that this would stop the terrible disease that had been killing people for months. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 was shocked. He remembered that the government had sprayed the town for the mosquitoes to stop the disease. Now they were saying it came from the pigs? 𝗙𝗙𝗡 returned to his shop and closed the door. He smiled at his dogs, who hadn't moved since he left. 𝗙𝗙𝗡 felt badly for his neighbors, but at the same time, he was grateful that the mystery of this disease seemed to be solved, and that now 𝗙𝗙𝗡 really was safe. It was nearly impossible to avoid all mosquitoes like 𝗙𝗙𝗡 had been trying to do, but he had no reason to interact with pigs, which apparently were the reason this disease was spreading, and so 𝗙𝗙𝗡 really felt like he was going to be okay. 2 days later, 𝗙𝗙𝗡 woke up feeling feverish. His head was pounding and he couldn't pull himself from the bed. His skin felt like it was on fire. In a panic, he realized that he must be sick with this mysterious disease. 𝗙𝗏𝗡 didn't understand how this was happening to him. He hadn't gone near any pigs. But 𝗙𝗏𝗡 didn't have time to worry about that. He needed to get to a hospital. He managed to drag himself out of bed and stumbled over to a neighbor's house where he knew there was a phone. He begged the neighbor to please call him an ambulance, and then 𝗙𝗏𝗡 collapsed to the ground. A few minutes later, the paramedics arrived and took 𝗙𝗏𝗡 to the nearest major hospital, which was about 50 miles to the north, at the University Hospital in Kuala Lumpur. The intake nurse in the emergency room asked 𝗙𝗏𝗡 to describe his symptoms and when they started, and 𝗙𝗏𝗡, who had been strapped to a gurney for the entire ambulance ride, felt his voice stick in his throat. To his horror, he couldn't respond. He tried to swallow, but it was no use. He was totally paralyzed. 𝗙𝗏𝗡 could see the nurse's eyes widen in alarm. He watched, terrified, as the nurses wheeled him through the hospital, helpless as he felt his body lock around him. It didn't take long to confirm that 𝗙𝗏𝗡's sickness was indeed the same virus that Dr. 𝗙𝗏 had identified in Colorado at the CDC research lab. But that knowledge didn't help 𝗙𝗏𝗡's doctors. Shortly after he was admitted, 𝗙𝗏𝗡 fell into a vegetative state and then died. In early June of 1999, around 3 months after 𝗙𝗏𝗡 died, Dr. 𝗙𝗏 was back at his office in Kuala Lumpur. It seemed like the mystery virus had been defeated, all thanks to Dr. 𝗙𝗏's quick thinking. But Dr. 𝗙𝗏 wasn't sure if the mystery really was completely solved. The virus he had identified at the CDC's lab was called a paramyxovirus. This virus is transmitted from livestock animals to people, and many of the patients who had caught it worked with pigs. It wasn't affecting Muslims because they didn't eat pork. But many people in the country did eat pork, so Dr. 𝗙𝗏 and a team of experts had advised the Malaysian authorities that if they wanted to stop the disease, they would have to make the difficult decision to kill as many pigs as possible in the affected areas. The government reacted quickly and sent squads of soldiers to eliminate over 1 million pigs. And after they did that, sure enough, cases of this mysterious disease started to dwindle. When it came to naming the virus, officials looked to the small pig farming town it had originated in and where 𝗙𝗏𝗡, the cabinet maker, was from, Nipah. They would call it the Nipah virus. But something kept bothering Dr. 𝗙𝗏. Most of the Nipah virus victims were farmers who had direct contact with infected pigs, which made sense. But nearly 20% of the patients had minimal or no contact with the animals, but they still got this disease. 𝗙𝗏𝗡, the cabinet maker, was one of those unlucky 20%. Dr. 𝗙𝗏 knew that 𝗙𝗏𝗡 must have caught this disease somewhere, and if it wasn't from pigs, then where did he get it from? Could it be that another animal was spreading the Nipah virus in addition to the pigs? 𝗙𝗏 started to wonder if pigs really were the source of the virus or if they were just a carrier. Maybe, he thought, the true source of the virus was another creature altogether. And so now that the outbreak was under control following the elimination of all these pigs, the Malaysian government deployed a team of researchers to try to determine the true source of the Nipah virus. As the scientists investigated, they found that the Nipah virus was closely related to another virus that had caused a small outbreak in Australia a few years earlier. At the time, researchers had been able to identify the source of the outbreak. It was fruit bats. So now, Malaysian researchers quickly zeroed in on an extraordinary type of bat called the flying fox, which lived near the village of Nipah and throughout the country. These animals, among the largest bats in the world, can have wingspans of up to 5 feet, but they're not normally harmful to humans. They mostly mind their own business, feeding on fruit trees like durian, which was one of the primary crops grown in Nipah. But when researchers captured some flying foxes for study, they found that a large number of them tested positive for Nipah virus. The virus did not seem to harm the animals at all, but the researchers suddenly realized that the bats themselves were doing enormous harm to the people all around them. The bats, not the pigs and not the mosquitoes, were the real source of this terrible disease. Here's how it worked. The bats came out at night to feed on the durian flowers, and as they did that, their droppings and urine would fall to the ground below them. When morning came, the pigs were let out of their pens and they came into contact with the bat droppings and the bat urine that was contaminated with the Nipah virus. And so did other animals, like horses and dogs, and in turn, these animals passed it on to their owners. That's how people who did not work with pigs became infected, and that's how 𝗙𝗏𝗡, the cabinet maker, got the virus. At some point, his dogs must have sniffed around some durian trees and come into contact with infected droppings, and then when 𝗙𝗏𝗡 went to play with them and the dogs licked his face, they passed the virus on to him. In the past, there had never been a Nipah virus outbreak because fruit trees like durian and the bats were far from any industrial animal farms. But as farming expanded in Malaysia, fruit orchards were planted right next to pig farms and other commercial areas, which allowed the disease to spread. The discovery that fruit bats were the real spreader of the virus allowed the researchers to truly understand how the Nipah virus operated. But it also meant that future outbreaks would be impossible to stop. The fruit bats responsible for the Nipah virus live throughout Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. There's no way to effectively control their population or to stop them from eating fruit from commercial farms. So the only way to truly stop the Nipah virus is to create a vaccine for it. But scientists haven't figured out how to make one yet. In recent years, there have been more outbreaks around the world, striking fear into scientists and public health officials. The World Health Organization has labeled this virus as being a virus with catastrophic global pandemic potential. If the virus ever becomes airborne, it could be transmitted through coughs, sneezes, or contaminated surfaces. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories. We use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Kinsey Clark. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and 𝗙𝗏𝗙 𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗘. Fact-checking was done by Bennett Logan. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is 𝗙𝗏𝗙. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Laura Donna Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Moore. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.